Miss Marple and the Curtains That Moved at Midnight. Chapter 1. The Rose Festival. The sun shone with a gentle warmth on the small village of Little Daring, where gardens overflowed with flowers and secrets lay dormant beneath layers of politeness. It was the kind of place where life moved unhurriedly, punctuated by the clinking of teacups, the crunch of gravel under polished shoes, and the inevitable unannounced visits from neighbours eager to check in. Mrs. Lavinia Blackwood, elegant widow with a reputation for being excessively reserved, was hosting its now traditional Rose Festival that Saturday, an occasion when the townspeople gathered in its extensive garden to celebrate the blooming of its famous collection of antique roses. The air was perfumed with the scent of petals and saturated with social murmurs, some friendly, some not so much. "Have you seen Lavinia's niece?" Mrs. Carter whispered, lowering her voice, though no one bothered to hide their curiosity. "She arrived from London last night. They say she works in the theatre." "Theatre, imagine! Oh dear, no wonder he has that way of walking. As if he were always acting." Mrs. Topham replied, bringing a small spoonful of iced lemon to her lips, without taking her eyes off the young woman in the scarlet dress, who was moving gracefully among the guests. The niece in question, Delilah Blackwood, was barely 26 years old, but her mere presence seemed to break the stillness of the town. She watched everyone with a mixture of amusement and calculation, as if she were rehearsing for a role she hadn't yet been cast in. Miss Marple, sitting in the shade of a flowered parasol, knitted with slow, steady movements. She didn't say much, but her blue eyes, which seemed even clearer against her silver hair, flipped from one face to another, from a careless sentence to a nervous gesture. She watched as always, not with judgment, but with a patience forged by years of listening to human nature speak, even when mouths were silent. "Funny," Miss Marple murmured, more to herself than to anyone else, "how some people pretend to be at ease where they aren't, and how others are too comfortable where they shouldn't be." The afternoon progressed amid laughter, discreet dancing, and exaggerated praise for Lavinia's hybrid roses. But as the sun set and the gold turned to blue, a subtle unease took hold of the garden. It was like a cold gust through the temperate air. "Have you noticed?" asked Mrs. Templeton, approaching Miss Marple. "The curtains in the drawing-room. They've moved." Miss Marple squinted at the first-floor window. The lace fabric, which had remained motionless all afternoon, stirred once more, just for a second. There was no breeze. "Maybe someone opened a window," Miss Marple suggested, though her voice didn't sound entirely convinced. "The windows haven't been opened since Mr. Blackwood died," Mrs. Templeton replied. "Lavinia says the frames are swollen. He says it all the time." The comment hung in the air like a drop of ink in clear water, and in the next moment a shrill scream cut through the garden, cutting through all conversations like a sharp blade. "There's blood in the upstairs hallway." The guests ran, clumsy and incredulous, toward the house. Mrs. Lavinia was the first to reach the foot of the stairs, her gaunt face whiter than porcelain. The other voices merged into a chaos of exclamations as footsteps echoed on the ancient wood. Delilah Blackwood lay on the upper landing, a dark stain spreading across the bodice of her red dress. A broken wineglass lay next to her hand, and on the wall behind her a line of blood ran slowly downward, almost as if someone had carefully drawn it. The curtains behind her were fluttering again, and Miss Marple, who had arrived unhurriedly, watched with her blue eyes, silent as the dawn. She said nothing, not when the police were called, nor when the town doctor declared that Delilah was dead, most likely poisoned before she fell. I didn't need to say anything. Not yet. Chapter 2. The Tuesday Lunch Rumour. The next day dawned deceptively, calm in Little Daring. The sky was a uniform grey, and a light drizzle fell on the roof tiles of the houses. But in the warm interiors, behind the embroidered curtains and steaming teapots, the whisper had begun to multiply like ivy. At Mr. Jeffers's grocery store, the townspeople spoke in hushed voices, but their eyes glittered with curiosity. It wasn't every day that a young woman was found dead in a respectable house in the midst of a rose feast, and certainly not in a house like Lavinia Blackwood's, who had spent years cultivating not only her flowers, but her reputation for unwavering decorum. "They say it was poison," Mrs. Hargreaves commented, carefully selecting some plums, "that he spat out blood before he fell." "No, no, my dear. It was a blow to the head. The doctor is only concealing it so as not to alarm Lavinia," replied Mrs. Woodhouse, who had an inexplicable confidence in her theories. "But it was poison," interrupted the young saleswoman Daisy. "How come you didn't notice anything in the glass? And why were the curtains moving?" The store fell silent for a moment. Even the patter of rain against the glass seemed to cease. "The curtains," Mrs. Hargreaves repeated in a whisper. "Strange things always begin with a half-open window. A few streets away, in her cosy, mossy-roofed house, Miss Marple knitted with her gnarled fingers, her mind racing over fragments of the previous day. She hadn't spoken much since the incident, though she'd observed more than most people imagined, remembered the slight trembling of Lavinia's lips as she approached her niece's body. It wasn't the trembling of a devastated woman. It was the trembling of someone terrified. He also remembered the young man who had served the wine, Malcolm Beckett, son of the Reverend's gardener, a nervous, rosy-cheeked boy who avoided looking at Delilah even when she gave him a mocking smile. And above all, he remembered the silence, that uncomfortable, artificial silence that fell over everyone as soon as the body was found, as if part of the town already knew something and was afraid the rest would find out. At mid-morning, Miss Marple went out for her usual stroll, wearing her wide-brimmed hat and carrying her silver-tipped cane. She didn't go directly to the Blackwoods' house, nor to the police station. She went to the rectory. There, like every Tuesday, a small group of women would gather for what they called Tuesday lunches, a low-key, unpretentious but effective tradition for bringing everyone up to date on the town's events. "Jane, dear," said Mrs. Templeton, seeing her arrive, "we were just about to serve the stew." Miss Marple sat down with a friendly smile, accepting the offered cup of tea. For the first few minutes the conversation revolved around trivial topics: Mrs. Benton's azaleas, the problems of the local post office, a cat falling into the church steeple, and then, inevitably, the subject changed. "Did you know Delilah used to come here as a child to spend summers?" Mrs. Winthrop said, her voice lower. "Lavinia didn't talk about her much, but we all knew something had happened to her parents. An accident, I think," said another. "They died in a fire, didn't they?" "So they say," Miss Marple replied gently. "But sometimes what's said is a neater way of forgetting the awkwardness." The conversation faltered. Miss Marple had planted her seed, and she knew it would germinate on its own. She didn't need to push. "By the way," Mrs. Templeton added, seizing the moment, "did anyone else see Mrs. Blackwood enter the library shortly before the body was found?" "No," Mrs. Winthrop replied, "but I heard you had an argument with Delilah just before the party. Something about a letter. Have they read it?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "Letters aren't always where we think they are," he murmured, almost to himself, "but they always leave traces, even in the memories of those who would like to forget them." The rain had stopped by then, but the unease lingered in the air. Miss Marple said goodbye politely, walked out calmly, and didn't look back. That night, as the town sank into another suspicious silence, someone in the Blackwood house crept down the stairs without turning on the lights. A thin, hooded figure crossed the darkened living room and closed the curtains on the first floor again. The same ones that had moved at midnight. Chapter 3. The Door Nobody Used. The local police, led by Inspector Craddock, had officially entered the scene the day after the crime, notebooks in hand and serious expressions. Little Daring, however, was not accustomed to being the scene of formal investigations, and many villagers were more interested in observing than cooperating. Some even cleaned their porches more frequently than necessary, hoping to hear something when the officers passed by. Inspector Craddock, an efficient man but not very keen on the town's social niceties, had first questioned Lavinia Blackwood. The interview was brief. Mrs. Blackwood, with the composure of a lady who clings to her manners as a shield, asserted that she had no idea why her niece had been murdered. She stated that Delilah had been perfectly normal during her stay, although somewhat scattered as if her mind were elsewhere. "Had you argued with her?" Craddock asked, taking notes without looking up. "Arguing? No," Lavinia said with a tight smile, "although, of course, we had our differences. Delilah, she had modern views, and I'm a woman of a certain age. He didn't say anything about the letter, or about his visit to the library. Miss Marple, for her part, was not among the official sources, but her presence did not go unnoticed. As she strolled near the Blackwood house that same afternoon, pretending to look at the rhododendrons, she noticed something that caught her attention. The side entrance to the house, an old wooden door leading to the side of the back garden, had a lock covered in a thin layer of rust, except for a thin metallic scratch right in the centre. It wasn't much. In fact, it would go unnoticed by almost anyone else, but Miss Marple had lived long enough to know that nothing that seems forgotten it really remains that way for so long. That door, according to village rumours, hadn't been used since the war, but someone had touched it recently, and with a key. Meanwhile, the preliminary autopsy confirmed what some suspected. Delilah had died of poisoning. Not from a fast-acting poison, but from an insidious one, digitoxin, extracted from foxglove, a plant commonly grown in English gardens. According to the doctor, it was administered in wine. Someone knew what they were doing. At the village cafe, that fact was the central topic. "Digitoxin," Mrs. Hargreaves said. "Isn't that what they used as heart medicine?" "In small doses," said the pharmacist, who was standing nearby. "But poorly administered, it can be lethal. Although not everyone would know how to use it. And who would have access to that?" asked Daisy the saleswoman. "A doctor? An apothecary? Or a gardener?" Miss Marple added softly, her voice barely raising. Everyone turned to look at her. "A gardener," Mrs. Woodhouse repeated. "Well, yes," Miss Marple continued, as if talking about the weather. "Foxglove grows in many gardens, but there's a difference between growing flowers and knowing exactly which parts to use and how to do it without leaving traces." Malcolm Beckett's name floated in the air, though no one mentioned it. The young man had worked during the summer in various gardens in the village, including the Blackwoods. His father, a serious and quiet man, was respected, but not particularly sociable. That afternoon, Miss Marple quietly made her way to the rectory. There she found the Reverend in his study, reading a sermon book. "Jane, what a pleasant surprise," Reverend Lane said, smiling. "May I offer you tea?" "Thank you, but it'll only be a short visit," Miss Marple replied. "I wanted to ask you, when was the last time anyone used the side entrance to Blackwood House?" The Reverend raised an eyebrow. "The door to the north wing, where the old pantry was." "Exactly that one." "My God, I don't know. Maybe since before Lavinia moved there, after the war. I think the north wing was closed for years. It had leaks and a problem with the chimney." "Why do you ask?" Miss Marple shook her head with a small smile. "Just curious. I thought someone tried using it recently." The Reverend nodded slowly. "Well, there are things that slumber in those big houses, secrets locked away out of habit rather than necessity." That night, as the town was fading away, Miss Marple wrote a few lines in her notebook. Nothing conclusive, just a list, Delilah and a letter. Lavinia entering the library. Side door with recent traces. Digitoxin, gardeners, apothecaries, doctors, curtains. Movement from inside. Outside, the rain was beginning to return, enveloping little Deering in a steady whisper, and at Blackwood House a shadow paused outside the same side door. This time he didn't open it. He just placed something on the threshold. An envelope. Chapter 4. The envelope with no return address. The next morning it was Mrs. Langtry, the Blackwood family's housekeeper for nearly 2 decades, who found the envelope on the side doorstep. She didn't usually inspect that entrance, considering it closed off due to disuse. But something had woken her up early that morning. "A feeling," she said later. "One of those strange impulses that have no logical explanation, but that eventually lead to the discovery of the unexpected." The envelope was white, its edges slightly damp from the night drizzle. It bore no return address, no address, and no stamp. It was sealed, but not sealed, and inside was a single sheet of paper, folded in half. Lavinia read it without making a sound. Her hands didn't tremble, but her face lost the little colour it still had since her niece's death. She immediately put the paper in a desk drawer, locking it before Mrs. Langtry could ask any more questions. "It's nothing," he said, forcing a smile. "Old memories, nonsense." But Mrs. Langtry wasn't so naive, and although she didn't say anything, that same afternoon her granddaughter, who helped clean at the rectory on Thursdays, whispered to Daisy, the shop assistant, that Lavinia looked as if she'd seen a ghost. Thus, the rumour of the envelope, with no return address, began to circulate around the town, without anyone knowing exactly what it said. But everyone they wanted to know. Miss Marple, upon hearing this, showed no surprise. She merely nodded slightly, as if the discovery confirmed something she had already anticipated. "It's not the envelope that's interesting," he commented to Reverend Lane during a brief visit. "It's the moment. Why leave it now? Do you think it's related to Delilah's death?" Miss Marple adjusted her gloves before answering. "I think it's no coincidence that someone who died of poisoning left so many loose threads, and that now those threads are being picked up one by one." Meanwhile, Inspector Craddock had questioned Malcolm Beckett again, this time more firmly. The young man flatly denied any knowledge of the poison, the cup, or the alleged argument between Lavinia and Delilah. "I just poured what I was told to pour," he insisted, looking down. "I didn't touch the wine. Delilah, she didn't even speak to me, actually. Not even during the party." Malcolm shrugged. "She mocked me. She said things I didn't understand, as if she knew something about me that I didn't." Craddock frowned. "And what did you think you knew?" "I don't know." But he looked at me as if it were all a game. Miss Marple listened to this detail with special attention when Craddock mentioned it to her informally at the vicarage. "A game, you said?" he repeated. "How curious, because that's exactly the impression Delilah gave. Me too, as if she were playing with silences, and with other people's memories." The afternoon brought with it a change in the wind, and with it the arrival of an unexpected visitor. A tall, well-dressed man with round glasses and a fedora got off the bus at the entrance to the village. He showed up at the Blackwood house unannounced and asked to see Lavinia. "I'm Mr. Howard Renfield," he said in a neutral voice, "solicitor, in charge of Miss Delilah Blackwood's will." That announcement fell like a stone into a still pond. Lavinia looked frozen, but she accepted it. No other guests had been received since the tragedy. No one knew exactly what was discussed during that meeting, but the fact is that from then on something changed in Mrs. Blackwood's demeanour. More than distressed, she seemed uneasy. That evening, Miss Marple decided to pay a seemingly innocent visit to the house. She brought with her a small plum cake, a recipe Delilah used to like as a child, she said. She was received politely, but cautiously. "Jane," Lavinia said, unable to suppress a sigh, "do you also think it was murder?" "I don't have any theories, my dear," Miss Marple replied pleasantly. "Only questions. Little questions about details that others might not notice. Like, for instance, whether Delilah brought anything more than suitcases with her from London." Lavinia's eyes narrowed slightly, almost imperceptibly. "Anything else? A letter, maybe? A document? Something you were planning to show? Or use?" "I don't know what you're talking about," Lavinia said. But there was a slight tremor in her teacup. Miss Marple didn't insist. She knew that the deepest secrets weren't revealed through confrontation, but through slow erosion, like water on stone. He left. He passed by the north wing. The door was still closed, but now someone had left a chair right next to it. A chair that hadn't been there the day before. A chair that faced directly toward the window. The same one where the curtains moved. Chapter 5. The Broken Name in the Will. The town woke up the next day with the feeling that something had fractured. It wasn't an open scandal or lurid news, at least not yet, but rather a subtle, barely perceptible tension that crept like an undercurrent beneath the usual conversations. The flowers were still blooming, the bread still smelled of the oven, but the apparent harmony of little daring was beginning to crack. Lawyer Howard Renfield hadn't left the village after his meeting with Lavinia Blackwood. He was staying at the local inn, in a room next to the library, where he was often seen writing notes with an old-fashioned fountain pen. He was reserved and discreet, but he couldn't help but run into Miss Marple at breakfast. "Miss Marple," he said, inclining his head slightly, "you are, how shall I put it, famous in certain circles for your wit." "Oh, don't exaggerate, Mr. Renfield," she said with a polite smile. "I'm just an old woman who's had the misfortune to see a lot of unpleasant things, and a memory long enough to remember them all." The lawyer made an ambiguous face. "Let's just say her reputation precedes her, and perhaps because of that, I wouldn't feel entirely uncomfortable mentioning one unusual detail." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "About Delilah?" "About his will, to be precise." There was a pause during which only the clinking of the sugar spoon in the teacup could be heard. "Miss Blackwood," Renfield continued, "changed her will 2 weeks before her death. She wrote it in London, in her own hand, and asked me to register it officially. The main change was her heir. And who was listed before? Lavinia Blackwood, her aunt, completely and unconditionally. And now," Renfield narrowed his eyes, "that's the funny thing. The name appears, broken, started but unfinished. Ma, she said, pronouncing it slowly. And then nothing. As if she'd been interrupted or hesitated. But the rest of the document is clear, valid, legally binding, although incomplete. And what do you lawyers interpret from a broken name? Legally, it invalidates the change, but morally, it may suggest intent." Miss Marple didn't reply immediately. Her thoughts travelled back to the conversation she'd had with Lavinia the previous evening, to the trembling in her cup, to the unreturned envelope. "Did you know Delilah personally?" "Only in the professional sphere. But I got the impression he didn't fully trust his family. And did he mention why he wanted to change his inheritance?" "He said he wanted to do the right thing. Nothing more. Not a word about threats, suspicions, or enmity." Miss Marple gently placed the cup on its saucer. "People who want to do the right thing have usually seen the wrong thing up close." Meanwhile, at Blackwood House, Lavinia was more nervous than ever. She avoided going out and ordered Mrs. Langtry to keep curious people away from the north wing. The side door was still closed, but now the chair next to it was gone. The police, for their part, were beginning to apply more pressure. Malcolm Beckett had been called to testify for the 3rd time. The pressure was making him sweat, and his answers were increasingly clumsy. However, there was no conclusive evidence against him. No fingerprints, no witnesses, only silence and averted glances. In the middle of the afternoon, Miss Marple went to visit the young gardener. She found him in the shed, carefully cleaning a spade. "Malcolm," he said softly, "I'm here to speak to you as someone who has seen many tragedies and some injustices." The young man looked at her suspiciously. His face was haggard, his beard stubble growing. He no longer looked the same as he had a few days ago. "I didn't kill her," he said immediately, without her having asked. "I didn't say you did," Miss Marple replied, "but sometimes fear makes people look guilty, and silence even more so." She knew something, Malcolm murmured. Something about my mother. He looked at her as if she knew an old secret, one no one else remembered. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Old secrets. They're often the most dangerous, because people build entire lives around them. And when someone threatens to expose them, well, some people prefer to kill rather than lose their cover. The young man swallowed. She said she'd leave something in writing, that the people should know the truth. I didn't understand what she meant, but now I'm afraid someone did. That evening at the rectory, Miss Marple opened her notebook once more and jotted down 2 words under her list of clues, and Pourlis, Margaret, Malcolm, Marple, and then an underlined line, a will that was never completed, because someone made sure it wasn't. Chapter 6. The Notebook Forgotten in the Attic. The attic of Blackwood House was a place no one had gone up to for years. Mrs. Langtry, with her usual practical sense, always said that the things stored up there belonged to another life, and that stirring up the dust only brought on sneezes. But that afternoon, for the first time in a long time, the light from a lantern flickered among the dusty rafters and forgotten boxes. It was Alice, Mrs. Langtry's young niece, who came upstairs. Lavinia had sent her to retrieve some antique curtains, a sudden, unexplained request, and although the girl didn't say so aloud, she suspected her employer had simply wanted her to get away from the main wing for a while. Alice rummaged through the wooden boxes, the old fabrics wrapped in tissue paper, the feathered hats worn with age, and then, upon opening a small suitcase made of cracked leather, she found it. A green-covered notebook, nameless, tied with a ribbon. He flipped through it out of curiosity, and as he read the first line written in purple ink, "The things you can't say out loud," he felt a chill run down his spine. The notebook was unsigned, but it was clear it belonged to a young woman. The first pages were fragments of thoughts, scattered reflections on village life, on secrets observed from windows, and silences heard behind doors. But as she progressed, the writing became firmer, more precise. It named people. It suggested connections. It mentioned things Alice didn't understand. The envelope from 1947, the sound behind the piano, the letter Lavinia burned. The last page was incomplete. It stopped mid-sentence. "If something happens to me, it wasn't. Alice came down from the attic with a pale face, clutching her notebook to her chest. She didn't hand it to Lavinia. Instead, she hid it in the inside pocket of her coat, and, when her shift was over, went straight to Miss Marple's house. The old woman greeted her with an expression of wise kindness, and let her speak without interruption. When Alice showed her the notebook, Miss Marple's eyes lit up with a spark that wasn't emotion, but recognition. "Delilah," she said, flipping her fingers through the pages. "I always knew she was more observant than she let on. Does this prove she was killed?" Alice asked, her voice shaking. Miss Marple closed the notebook. "It doesn't prove anything. Yet. But it confirms what I already suspected. Delilah knew too much, and someone wanted to silence her before she shared that knowledge." The next day, Miss Marple requested an audience with Inspector Craddock. She wasn't one to draw attention to herself, but she knew when it was necessary to break protocol. "Inspector," he began, sitting down in the chair in front of his desk. "I'm afraid we're looking for the culprit with our eyes fixed on the present, when perhaps we should be looking to the past." Craddock looked at her sceptically. "The past? Yes, there's an ancient story buried in this house. A story that involves more than the death of a young actress. Something to do with that side door, with an unfinished will, and now with a notebook hidden away for years." "What story?" Miss Marple took out a sheet of paper she had copied from Delilah's notebook. She handed it over delicately. "Does the expression, the 1947 envelope, ring a bell?" Craddock frowned. He was a practical man, but not a fool. He made a note of the date. He promised to investigate the archives, though he made it clear that this might take time. That night, Miss Marple returned home with more questions than answers. She opened her own research notebook and, beneath the clue lists, wrote a new heading, "The Year Everyone Forgot, 1947, and below a list began. Delilah was born in 1949. What happened 2 years earlier? What letter did Lavinia burn? Why does the side door lead to a walled-up room?" He closed the notebook and turned off the lamp. Outside the wind blew hard, making the apple tree branches rattle against the glass. At Blackwood House, Lavinia didn't sleep. She paced the library, her face drawn, her hands clasped tightly. On the mantelpiece, next to an antique picture frame, a page torn from a book burned, and in the still warm ash, a blackened but visible word could be read, "Madeline." Chapter 7. The Woman Who Never Appeared in the Photos. In the days following the notebook's discovery, the village of Little Daring seemed to fall into a sort of expectant rhythm. The usual rhythm of life continued. The baker was still baking. At 6, the children attended school, and the dogs barked behind the fences with the same regularity as ever. But something invisible had shifted in the air, as if everyone knew that the heart of the village was beating with a secret about to break the surface. Miss Marple kept thinking of one word. Madeline. There were no clear records of anyone by that name directly associated with the Blackwood family, nor were they found in recent parish records. But it was in an old box of photographs, forgotten in the rectory and recovered during a cleaning, that Miss Marple found her next clue. Reverend Lane, always willing to contribute his memory and sentimental objects, had brought the box with the intention of organizing it. When Miss Marple asked to look through it, it was almost as if she already knew she'd find something there. They were black and white photographs, hand-dated in blue ink on the back. Sunny summers by the river, picnics in the garden, and family. Portraits where posed smiles didn't always manage to hide the real tensions. One of them, dated 1946, showed a young couple, a handsome man in an army uniform and a woman with a blurred face, as if time had deliberately blurred her features. But the strange thing was that in every photo where she appeared, her face was partially or completely obscured by shadows, by blurring, by the reflection of the sun. Always, without exception, that was Madeline, the Reverend said, his voice a little uncertain. Madeline Rivers, if I recall correctly, a distant relative of Lavinia's. She was here for a while after the war, but didn't stay long. And why didn't it stay? Asked Miss Marple, leafing through the pages carefully. There was a scandal, though no one called it that. He left suddenly. Some said it was for health reasons, others for something that was never mentioned. And he died? Nobody knows for sure. He just disappeared." The word left an echo in the room. Disappeared. As if an entire life had evaporated under the carpet of respectability. Miss Marple was silent for a long moment. Then she asked to keep some of the photographs, promising to return them intact. That same afternoon, she visited Howard Renfield, the lawyer, who was still in town reviewing documents. He, intrigued by the mention of Madeline, offered to search the family archives for any references. After an hour, he found something curious. A property deed, signed by Lavinia Blackwood in 1950, but shared with a M. Rivers. No mention of kinship, no further follow-up. "This has no continuity," Renfield said, showing him the paper. "It's as if that person never existed after signing this." Miss Marple allowed herself a small exhalation. It wasn't exactly a surprise. What would happen, he asked, if the true heir to House Blackwood wasn't Lavinia, but someone else? Someone who disappeared under unclear circumstances? Renfield frowned. "Are you implying that Lavinia took something that wasn't hers?" "I'm suggesting that perhaps what happened in 1947 wasn't a simple oversight, but a calculated act, and that Delilah, for some reason, found the thread in that tangled skein, a thread that led to Madeline." Renfield looked at her silently, and then said, "And that's why he wanted to change his will, to do the right thing," repeated Miss Marple. That night, a new whisper began to circulate among the kitchens and cafes of Little Daring. It was said that Lavinia Blackwood had once had a sister, one she never spoke of, one who perhaps should never have disappeared. Meanwhile, Lavinia remained confined to her house, growing paler and more fragile every day. She rarely spoke to Mrs. Langtry, and allowed no visitors. But late at night, she could be seen lighting the study lamp, and pacing in circles in front of the portrait mantel. One of those portraits, which had always been face down, dusty and relegated to a corner, had now been moved to the centre. It showed two girls. One of them, clearly Lavinia, the other one, with the same eyes as Delilah. Chapter 8. The Portrait That Was Never in the Salon. In respectable English country houses, portraits are more than decoration. They are witnesses. They frame lineage, preserve memory, and their faces perpetuate what words sometimes prefer to keep silent. So when Miss Marple heard that a new portrait had suddenly been placed in the Blackwoods' drawing-room, her attention was sharpened to a needle. It wasn't exactly new, the rumours said, but one forgotten, old, dusty. It had previously been in an upstairs room, perhaps in the north wing. And, according to Mrs. Langtry, who couldn't resist telling the grocery store about it, it depicted two very young girls. One was clearly little Lavinia. The other, no one was sure. Maybe a cousin, Mrs. Hargreaves ventured, or a childhood friend. And why wasn't it in the drawing-room from the beginning? Daisy asked, frowning. No one keeps a family portrait in an attic unless they have reason to want it. Out of sight. Miss Marple said nothing at the time. But later, under the pretext of returning a borrowed book, she made an unexpected visit to the Blackwood house. Lavinia welcomed her into the library, thinner and more gaunt than ever. Her grey dress seemed to hang from her body like a shadow, and her hands trembled slightly as she poured the tea. "How nice of you to come, Jane," she murmured. I'm so tired lately. It's as if something's chasing me from far away." Miss Marple, without judging, nodded with that expression of quiet compassion she knew so well how to adopt. And then, with a gentleness that almost seemed accidental, she said, "I saw the new portrait, or should I say, the portrait." Ancient Lavinia dropped the spoon into the saucer with a soft clink. "Oh, yeah. I found it while I was tidying up. I thought it was supposed to be in the living room. You know, out of respect for those who are no longer here." "A noble decision," said Miss Marple, inclining her head. "She reminded me of your niece. They have the same eyes." "Delilah?" Lavinia said, a hint of bitterness in her voice. She was always too much like her. Too alive. "Who are you referring to, Lavinia?" There was a heavy silence. For a moment Miss Marple thought she would get no answer. But then the old woman looked up. Her eyes, wet and tired, no longer had the strength to resist. "To Madeline," he whispered. "My sister." The secret was no longer a secret. Miss Marple didn't speak. She let the weight of that name, that memory, fall gently over the room like a sheet covering a sleeping body. "Madeline was always the brilliant one," Lavinia continued. "Impulsive, beautiful. She made everyone turn around effortlessly, even Robert, the man I was going to marry." His fingers tightened around the cup. But he chose her. He eloped with her. They got back together months later, married, expecting a child. My parents were shocked. I became invisible, and that son, Miss Marple asked delicately. It was Delilah. Miss Marple had already sensed it. But hearing it confirmed was something else. The circle was beginning to close. "After Robert died in the fire," Lavinia continued, "Madeline came back to the house, desperate, broken, and sick. She couldn't take care of the baby. She left her with me and walked away. I never knew if she really died. She never wrote again. I raised Delilah as my own, even though she knew. She always knew." Miss Marple gently squeezed her interlocutor's hands. "Why not tell it? Why hide it all these years? Out of pride, out of shame. Because I couldn't stand being my sister's shadow even after her death. And when Delilah started investigating, talking about rewriting her will, about restoring the truth, I got scared." His eyes searched Miss Marple with a mixture of pleading and guilt. "Do you think I was capable of killing her?" Miss Marple didn't reply. Not yet. Because although the motive was beginning to take shape, pride, jealousy, legacy, the pieces of the crime still didn't quite fit together. As she left the house, she looked at the portrait again. The two girls were posed with forced smiles. One had darker hair, her chin lifted naturally. The other seemed to be holding herself up with effort, as if her place in the picture wasn't truly hers. That night in her research diary, Miss Marple wrote, Delilah wasn't just looking for the truth. She wanted to show it. And someone, maybe more than one, needed her to remain hidden. Chapter 9. The Night the Curtains Moved Again. Little Daring slept under a thick fog that night seemed reluctant to dissipate. The streetlights barely outlined the hedges and gates, and the usual sounds, the calls of owls, the creaking of branches, had become faint, as if the air itself refused to vibrate normally. Amidst that damp silence, something stirred again in the Blackwood house. the curtains on the first floor. It was Alice Langtry who saw it from the street. She was returning late from Mrs. Templeton's sewing workshop when, instinctively, she glanced toward the library window. The fabric stirred as before, not from the wind, there wasn't one that night, but from within. Not violently, but with an almost deliberate slowness, as if someone were making sure it could be seen from outside. Alice stopped. She looked around. There was no one else on the street. She hesitated for a moment, then hurried to the rectory, where she knew Miss Marple would still be awake. She found her in her parlour, sitting in front of the fireplace, leafing through Delilah's notebook for the umpteenth time. "They've moved again," Alice said without preamble. "The curtains." Miss Marple closed the notebook calmly, as if she had been waiting for it. "The library? Yes, same time as last time." Miss Marple stood up, took her coat, and without more than a brief nod, left with Alice in the direction of Blackwood House. They didn't knock on the front door. They circled around the side of the garden, where the gravel path led to the side entrance, the door everyone said no one used, but someone had used it. The scratch on the lock, the envelope left on the threshold, and now the light filtering in from underneath. "Wait here," Miss Marple said in a low voice. Alice obeyed. The old woman moved forward with silent steps, as if she had been walking in the dark all her life. She tried the handle. Surprisingly, the door wasn't locked. As she pushed it, a soft creak announced her entry. Inside, the air smelled of damp wood and something less definable. A trace of ancient perfume, perhaps. She moved cautiously down the hallway, following the faint glow coming from the study. The library was lit by a floor lamp, and in the centre of the room, with her back to the door, stood Lavinia. She was wearing her blue velvet robe and holding a small portrait, the same one that had been moved into the living room days before. The frame had a crack in the corner. When she heard the floor creak behind her, she didn't start. "I knew you'd come," he murmured without turning around. "The curtains again, Lavinia," said Miss Marple. "Why?" Lavinia sat down carefully in the armchair by the fire. She looked infinitely tired. "Someone's coming for me. I don't know if it's my sister or my conscience. Maybe both." Miss Marple approached slowly. "Did you move the curtains that night? The night Delilah was killed?" Lavinia didn't respond immediately. Then she shook her head. "No, that night it wasn't me. But tonight it was. Tonight I needed to know if anyone was watching, if anyone was still willing to see what isn't being said." Miss Marple sat opposite her. "Lavinia, who knew the truth about Madeline before Delilah found her?" "Only 3 people," he replied in a small voice. "Me, Mrs. Langtry, and someone else." "Malcolm Beckett?" Lavinia nodded slightly. "He was just a boy. His mother worked here back in the scandal. He heard things. He saw Madeline in the halls, and then, years later, he recognized something in Delilah. The way she looked. The voice. I saw the way he looked at her, not with desire, but with fear, as if she were the echo of something he wanted to forget." Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment, understanding. "Do you think Malcolm?" "I don't know," Lavinia said, her voice breaking. "But when Delilah told me about the will, about the old letter, when she told me she wanted to clear the family name, Return the inheritance to whomever it belonged. Someone heard her, and they came forward. Miss Marple leaned forward, gently but firmly. And you, Lavinia? Did you ever think of arresting her? There was a long silence. Finally, Lavinia looked up. I thought about it, but I didn't have the courage. Not to silence her, not to protect her. Miss Marple stood up slowly. Sometimes what we don't do weighs more than what we do. As he stepped outside, he found Alice still waiting in the shadows. She didn't say anything, but in his mind the pieces were beginning to fall into place. Delilah, Madeline, Lavinia, Malcolm, and between them, a truth so ancient they'd all grown up with it without knowing it. But now that truth was awakening, and someone else still wasn't willing to let her go. Chapter 10. The Letter That Was Never Sent. The next day the air in Little Daring had a different weight. The fog had begun to dissipate, but not the veil covering the mystery of Delilah Blackwood's death. The church bells pealed softly in the distance as Miss Marple walked serenely to Reverend Lane's office. She carried with her a sealed, weathered envelope that Alice Langtry had found hidden in the false bottom of an old sewing box. "I found it this morning," Alice had said quietly. "It was in the attic, among the scraps Madeline used. It has her handwriting on it, but it was never sent." Miss Marple didn't open it immediately. She had learned that sometimes the silence that precedes a revelation is as important as the revelation itself. Now, in the dim light of the parish office, she delicately slipped it out of its wrapping. The paper was thin, but the ink was still legible, dated March 1947. "Dear Lavinia, I don't expect you to forgive me, but if you ever find this letter, it's because you've looked again where you always avoided. I didn't leave out of pride. I left because I knew you'd never be able to raise Delilah if I stayed. You needed her more than I did. I thought silence would save us all. I was wrong. Silence only rots the roots. Madeline." Miss Marple read the words twice. Then she read them aloud to the Reverend, who listened with a sombre expression. "Do you think Lavinia always knew about the existence of this letter?" "No," Miss Marple replied gently. "I think it was Madeline who came first. She wanted to leave him something in case the truth ever came out. And now it has." "And the contents?" the Reverend asked. "Is it enough to incriminate anyone?" "No," said Miss Marple, "but it's enough to understand the soul of crime." Meanwhile, Inspector Craddock had begun reviewing the statements again. A further visit to Malcolm Beckett revealed a previously overlooked detail. In his locker in the shed, among tools and gloves, they found a white linen handkerchief stained with dried wine. The same wine Delilah had drunk the night of her death. "How do you explain this, boy?" Craddock asked. Malcolm turned pale. I found it lying in the garden the next morning. I was going to throw it away, but I didn't want them to think Why didn't you hand it over right away?" "Because I got scared. I didn't kill her, but I knew someone had used it." Miss Marple, present at the scene courtesy of the inspector, watched without intervening until the young man finished speaking. Then she came closer and said, "Tell me, Malcolm, were you in the north wing the night of the party?" The young man looked at her with restrained horror. "How do you know?" "Because someone left the attic door open, and on the cloth covering the trunk where they kept the photo albums, there was a fresh print. From a small hand, like yours." Malcolm collapsed into a wooden chair. I wanted to find the letter. The letter she said existed. She told me she knew who I was, that it all went back to what my mother heard when she worked here. She said there was something else, that Lavinia wasn't the only one keeping secrets, that Madeline had lied too. Miss Marple watched him closely. Did Delilah threaten you? No, but it made me feel like I had no right to be here, like my existence was tied to something dirty. I just wanted to understand. And you poisoned her for that? Malcolm shook his head vigorously. No, I just wanted to find that letter, to prove that Lavinia was responsible, that it all started with her. But when I found the handkerchief, I realized someone had already gotten there. Later that day, Miss Marple sat with Lavinia once more. She handed her Madeline's letter without saying a word. Lavinia read it silently. She didn't cry. She just dropped the paper onto her lap, as if it weighed tons. I knew it then, he murmured. I knew I couldn't handle the truth, that I'd always run from it. And yet he came back, Miss Marple said, not in person, but through his daughter, and now, perhaps, through her story as well. Lavinia closed her eyes. Do you think it was me? Miss Marple shook her head tenderly. I think the crime was committed by someone who wanted silence at any price, and you, Lavinia, didn't know how to stop it. As night fell, the village of Little Daring seemed quieter than ever. The curtains on the upper floor of Blackwood House didn't move this time, but something had shifted, the weight of years of unanswered questions. Miss Marple sat in her chair by the fire, leafing through Delilah's notebook for the last time. On the back page there was a crossed-out sentence, barely legible under the ink. I'm not looking for revenge. I just want someone to listen, and Miss Marple, like so many times before, had listened. Chapter 11. The Name He Signed with a Lie. The penultimate morning of the case dawned with unusual clarity, as if the sky had been washed clean overnight. The shadows in the town were less dense, but those in the hearts remained. The investigation into Delilah's death had exposed old wounds, broken families, and a lineage reconstructed through shared silences. And yet, one piece was missing. Miss Marple knew it. It wasn't enough to know the reasons. It was necessary to see clearly who moved the final hand. It was attorney Howard Renfield who, upon re-examining the documents relating to the Blackwood estate, discovered the irregularity. There are 2 Lavinia Blackwood signatures, she told Miss Marple that afternoon, as she welcomed her into her room at the inn. One on the original 1949 will, and one on the 1950 joint ownership deed with Madeline Rivers. But they're not the same. It's not just the stroke that's different. The whole style is different. Miss Marple raised her eyebrows. Are you suggesting that someone forged a signature? I suspect so, and I don't think it was Lavinia. Renfield handed out 2 documents, one with a firm, upright, authoritative signature, Lavinia M. Blackwood, the other, trembling, more calligraphic, less sure, L.M. Blackwood. This second signature, he explained, also appears on a bank form I found attached to a trust created in 1951. Curiously, that trust was cancelled the following year, but not by Lavinia. It was cancelled by someone else, using her name. Marple nodded slowly. It was no longer a simple story of family shame or mistakes buried in the past. Someone had used Lavinia's name was used to deflect a truth, and someone else had begun to unearth it. And who else had access to those documents at that time? Miss Marple asked. Any member of the household staff at the time, anyone with access to the family office, and enough confidence to navigate through paperwork. Miss Marple immediately thought of Mrs. Langtry. That afternoon she returned to the Blackwood house. Lavinia was asleep, Alice said, exhausted by the revelations of the last few days. But Mrs. Langtry was in the kitchen, preparing a valerian infusion. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Langtry," Miss Marple greeted her in her most cordial tone. "I've come to ask you something very simple." "Yes, Miss Marple. Do you remember witnessing the signing of Lavinia's trust in 1951? The old servant didn't respond immediately. She placed the teapot too carefully on the marble, as if dropping it might cause everything to crumble. "No, not exactly," she murmured. "I organized the papers. Sometimes I signed receipts, minor things. Lavinia trusted me." "Did Madeline trust you too?" The spoon fell to the floor with a dry metallic sound. "What do you know about Madeline?" Miss Marple kept her gaze fixed. "I know she didn't die in 1948, as was said. I know she came back more than once. I know you were the bridge between her and Lavinia when no one else could have known." Mrs. Langtry sank into a chair. There were no tears, just profound exhaustion. "Madeline didn't mean any harm," she said finally. "She just wanted Delilah to have a future, a clean one, without her scandal, without her name tainted. And that's why he used his sister's name. That's why she signed herself as Lavinia, to protect her daughter. And then, when she really disappeared, the past was left unsaid. Lavinia didn't want anyone to know." Miss Marple nodded. "But Delilah started pulling on that thread." "Yes, and then someone wanted to cut the thread altogether. There was a long silence. Was it you?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Were you the one who poisoned the glass?" "No," Mrs. Langtry whispered, "but I know who did it. The tension was broken by a knock on the back door." Alice burst in, her face pale. "Miss Marple, Inspector Craddock has just arrested Malcolm Beckett." Miss Marple stood up immediately, but Mrs. Langtry stopped her. "It wasn't him, it was who? Daisy," he said, his voice deep. "The girl from the store. She's Madeline's daughter." Miss Marple stood still. The air suddenly became thick. "She found the letters too," Mrs. Langtry continued. "She wanted to avenge her mother. She believed Delilah had usurped her place, that Lavinia had stolen her life. She couldn't allow Delilah to inherit everything again." Miss Marple didn't say another word. She turned and hurried out. Her final act of crime hadn't been about hiding the truth, but about jealousy at having arrived late to it. The inheritance was not only of goods, it was an inheritance of identity, and now a life had been taken to protect a lie that was never completely true. Chapter 12. The Truth That Never Had Heirs. Malcolm. Beckett's arrest had been hasty, almost instinctive. The handkerchief with traces of wine on it, his presence on the night of the crime, his evasiveness, everything seemed to incriminate him. Inspector Craddock, although methodical, was beginning to give in to the pressure to close the case. But that same night, While the villagers murmured in the warmth of their kitchens, Miss Marple walked with determined steps toward the grocery store. Daisy stood there alone, closing the cash register with an impatient expression. Seeing the old woman come in, she tried to smile. "Miss Marple, do you need anything at this hour?" "Just answers, my dear," he said gently, "and I think you have them." Daisy clenched her jaw. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple didn't bother beating around the bush. She took a copy of a letter from her bag, found among Madeline Rivers's forgotten effects. It wasn't a confession, but a testimony addressed to an unrecognized daughter. She spoke of the pain of having to give up Delilah, and of the grief for another daughter, born in the shadow of shame, who never got to claim her own. Her mother was Madeline, Miss Marple said gently, without accusation. "You discovered that not long ago. You probably found this letter among some old belongings, and instead of going to Lavinia or Delilah, you decided to take the law into your own hands." Daisy didn't speak, but her silence was more eloquent than any confession. Miss Marple continued, with that implacable serenity that was her trademark. "Delilah didn't steal your place. She didn't ask to be born under a false name either. Your mother tried to protect you both, and you, blinded by what and received, decided that no one else should inherit what, believe it, T." Daisy took a step back. "She had everything," he whispered. "The name, the house, the history." "And you had the secret," said Miss Marple. "Access to the bottles at the party. Enough knowledge. Perhaps you read about digitoxin in the medical journal that someone forgot. Perhaps you thought the death would look like an accident." "I wasn't planning on killing her," Daisy said, her voice cracking now. "Just to scare her, just to make her see what she owed me." "But poison doesn't negotiate, my dear," Miss Marple replied with infinite sadness. "And pride seldom forgives in time." Inspector Craddock arrived minutes later, alerted by Mrs. Langtry. Daisy was arrested, without resistance, no screams, no denials, just a resigned gesture, as if she had imagined this ending many times before. Days later, Little Daring began to return to its usual rhythm. The bells rang again, the buns returned to the shop windows, and the children played in the gardens as if the world hadn't changed. But in the Blackwood house, silence still reigned. Lavinia, more bent than ever, decided to leave the village. She would leave the house in the care of Lawyer Renfield, while she retired to a residence in Bath, where no one would know her name or her story, as she said in a broken voice. Miss Marple went to say goodbye. "Sometimes," Lavinia said as she packed some letters, "the greatest sins aren't committed, they're allowed." "Perhaps," said Miss Marple, "but confession isn't an act of punishment, it's an act of liberation. Madeline tried to do the right thing. So did Delilah. You still have time." Lavinia smiled painfully. "Why, Jane, there's no one left to tell. You're left. Malcolm Beckett was exonerated after Daisy's full testimony, but his reputation, as happens in small towns, was tarnished. He accepted a job offer up north, far from the foxgloves, broken glasses, and rumours that followed him through the streets. Alice Langtry, on the other hand, became a sort of quiet heroine. No one said it out loud, but they knew her intuition, and courage helped reveal the truth. Miss Marple gave her a quill pen engraved with her initial, and a piece of advice. Don't worry so much about what people hide, Alice. Sometimes the most important thing is what they decide to show. At home, surrounded by fresh flowers and her unfinished knitting, Miss Marple wrote the last entry in her notebook, Delilah Blackwood. She wasn't just the victim of a crime, but of an inheritance of secrets she never asked for. Daisy Rivers, the product of a silence that turned into resentment, and Madeline, the shadow she tried to protect, but ended up enveloping everyone. The Blackwood house was empty, but the curtains no longer moved. There was no one inside who needed to hide or scream without being heard. The truth, finally, had settled within those walls, and Miss Marple, with her hot tea, returned to observing the world from her window, not like someone watching, but as someone who simply comprehends.